For as long as we have created structures for our own protection and shelter, wildlife have taken advantage of these structures for the very same reasons. From impressive historic ruins and stone structures which are dotted around the rural landscape and are now colonised by a diverse range of birds and mammals, to wildlife which has moved in to the heart of city centres and urban areas to share our own homes and live amongst us. Buildings are now an integral component of the Irish landscape for wildlife, and a diverse range of species of birds and mammals use buildings for breeding and for roosting, many of which are of conservation concern, and also many species have become reliant on buildings for their survival. Because of the importance of these artificial habitats for wildlife, any changes to the built environment has the potential to affect the species that use these buildings. And the loss of old stone structures has been linked to declines in species such as barn owl and such as swift, which use them for nesting. And modern buildings as well, they don't provide the same opportunities as old buildings do. In addition, any changes to buildings such as renovations have the potential to negatively affect wildlife that are present. And one of the biggest threats to wildlife in buildings is actually lack of awareness. And that's lack of awareness that wildlife are present and use buildings in the first place, but also lack of understanding of how to plan and carry out renovations or changes to a building to minimise the effects on wildlife. And also the legislation concerning the protection of wildlife in buildings. So we've produced this video to highlight awareness of the importance of buildings for wildlife, to showcase some of the wildlife that use buildings and the types of buildings they use, and also to provide advice on how to plan and carry out renovations to buildings which are important for wildlife to minimise the negative effects to wildlife. And also, importantly, how to create space for nature. If you're creating new builds or creating renovations, how can you incorporate roosting and breeding opportunities for wildlife to provide benefits for these species that are dependent on buildings? It's at sites like these that the built world and the natural world appear to just merge seamlessly together. And at buildings like these, people have moved out a long time ago, but when they have, nature moves in and takes advantage. We're really so lucky here in Ireland that so many of these historic ruins remain intact like this and are still standing. And they're really important from a cultural perspective. They're a window into our past, but nowadays they're also so important for biodiversity. And it's very easy to see why. Just by looking at this building, you can see the amount of nooks and crannies and crevices and ledges that are perfect roosting and breeding sites for different birds and different mammals. And practically every available space is taken up. And the list of species that have used this particular building is really impressive. So we've had barn owl, kestrel, raven, peregrine, swift, obviously jackdaw, it's full to the brim of jackdaw, and also several species of bats. So all that wildlife condensed into one site just shows just how important these buildings are.
Farmland dominates the Irish landscape. Our native flora and fauna depends on these habitats to survive and thrive. Equally, farm buildings are really important. There's literally hundreds and thousands of them dotted around the landscape, each providing unique opportunities for species to roost and to nest in our farmland landscape. Typically, traditional stone buildings on farms are very good for wildlife, but even modern buildings can be quite significant too. Some species are quite common to farm buildings, such as barn swallows. Others are more rare, like barn owls. Birds will use farm buildings in spring and summer to nest and rear their young. In the autumn and winter, they may choose to roost in the sheds for protection from the weather and the elements. It's important where birds or bats are nesting that they're left undisturbed. So some will tolerate a busy shed like swallows, others like barn owls will be less happy with it comings and goings all the time. Additional opportunities can be provided for birds and bats by providing nest boxes and roost boxes in your farm buildings around the farmyard. Swallow chicks are messy. Their droppings gather below the nest and it can form a mess in a tool shed or on machinery or whatever. So one way to avoid this is maybe covering the machinery or the tools below the nest. In a situation where swallows or other birds need to be excluded from a shed because of hygiene reasons, it's important to make sure the exclusions are in place before the breeding season. Exclude the birds getting back in and building their nest in the first place. Never remove a nest during the breeding season, as it's highly illegal. As with any bird species, if you find an active nest, it's best to leave them undisturbed.
Modern buildings like these are typically less suitable for wildlife than older stone structures, and that's because there's less access into the buildings firstly, and also fewer cavities and crevices and ledges that certain species need for nesting and for roosting. But that doesn't mean that wildlife don't use or occupy buildings like these, and it also means that there's a lot we can do to improve these types of buildings for wildlife. House martin is one bird that use buildings like these modern buildings and even occupied buildings, and they typically build their nest out of mud at the apex of the building. So the nest is, you can see the nest, it's very obvious and very noticeable their comings and goings. Swift is another migratory bird that arrives here from Africa, and they're almost completely dependent on buildings for nest sites. And they can nest in old stone structures, but also as well in more modern buildings and right in towns and villages and cities. Starlings as well will frequently use buildings and get access under the eaves. And also bats can use attic spaces and often occur even without our knowledge. We should also expect the unexpected when it comes to wildlife in buildings, and as long as there's opportunities, certain species, even if we don't associate them or consider them using buildings, can move in and take advantage. Many species have also adapted to move into busy built-up areas and even city centres, and there's different reasons for this. For some species it might be the greater food availability in urban areas, and for other species it might be a slight increase in temperature, particularly during the winter, and for other species it might be greater protection from predators. But whatever the reason, even in areas where there's a lot of people, urban environments, we should expect that there are wildlife around and that we are in close proximity to wildlife. So we've seen how important buildings are for wildlife and the wide range of species that use and occupy buildings. And with that means that that wildlife associated with buildings, they can be affected if there's any changes to the buildings, such as renovations or if the buildings are knocked. And the breeding and resting sites of protected wildlife are afforded protection under the Wildlife Act, and that means it's an offence to cause disturbance to wildlife in buildings. One of the most important things to be aware of is the potential for wildlife to use buildings, and you should never assume that wildlife aren't present, because many of the species that do use buildings, they can be quite discreet and their nesting or roosting sites can be tucked away, may not be immediately obvious. So once you know if wildlife is present and then what species are present, that'll allow you to plan the works to avoid disturbance to those wildlife species. And one of the main things is avoiding the sensitive times. So for breeding birds in a building, that would be the breeding season, typically March to August, and also as well for roosting bats and during hibernation in winter. And sometimes you may need to seek advice, and that can be from the National Parks and Wildlife Service to help you understand if there's species, if there's wildlife using buildings, and how to plan works on a building that's within the legal requirements, and also your local heritage officer and Birdwatch Ireland and Bat Conservation Ireland. So it's all about understanding the species that are present, the potential impacts of the works, and planning the works to avoid those effects on wildlife. And it's also really important to know that if there are changes to the building, that doesn't necessarily mean that the sites are lost for wildlife. And it's quite easy to replicate suitable nesting and roosting sites for wildlife by providing artificial sites like nest boxes. Many wildlife species in Ireland are dependent on buildings for their survival, and many of these species have adapted to use particularly old stone structures for nesting and roosting. But as we have lost a lot of these structures in the Irish landscape and they've been replaced by more modern buildings, there's less opportunities, less nesting and roosting sites available for these species. But this is something that can be remedied, and a lot of these species, we can recreate their nesting requirements by creating artificial nest sites and particularly nest boxes, but also, we can also get creative by providing suitable nesting and roosting opportunities for them. And there's loads of examples of where people have provided suitable artificial nesting and roosting sites for wildlife, like building in nesting space for swifts in new builds, and also creating space for barn owls in modern and occupied buildings, as well as providing nest boxes in other buildings that were previously unsuitable for nesting, but with the nest box now there's nesting opportunities. And so by taking these simple measures, it means that even though the built environment is continuing to expand, that there's still space for nature. Conflict can occur when wildlife move into buildings or onto buildings where they're not wanted and where problems can occur. And this can be because of noise associated with wildlife occupying buildings, or mess from droppings or from food from prey remains, but also as well if there is incidents of wildlife becoming aggressive. And it's important to understand the reasons why these issues occur, and that will allow us to inform how we can solve them. And in the vast majority of cases, it is possible to solve these problems. Herring gull is one species that has increased in numbers in urban areas, and particularly urban areas along the coast in recent years. And it's important to understand the reasons why that is, because actually herring gull populations nationally have declined quite dramatically. So because of depleted food resources in their more typical coastal nesting areas, that's one of the main reasons why we're seeing increases in urban areas. But with that there has been some conflict, and herring gulls now frequently nest on rooftops and in close proximity to people. And because they're now accustomed to being fed by people, that can cause issue. And also as well, during the breeding season, when they're rearing young, they can become defensive when their young come into close proximity to people, and that can and has caused issues. So it's important to understand the reasons why they're there in the first place and the nature of the problem, and that allows us then to find solutions. And always with wildlife in buildings, there are always solutions. That doesn't mean that wildlife are harmed. With herring gulls and other wildlife that aren't wanted on buildings, prevention is always the best course of action. They typically occupy buildings for a very short period during the nesting season, so after that to exclude, to proof the buildings so that they don't return, so that they don't nest there in future years. But that can be tricky in certain circumstances and does require professionals and does require expert advice.